This video is by Straight Goods News, SGNews.ca.
I'm Samantha for Straight Goods News, and I'm here interviewing Yves Engler about his book, The Ugly Canadian. So what surprised you most when researching The Ugly Canadian?
The depth to which the Harper government is lobbying on behalf of tar sands interests in Europe and in the U.S., and the extent to which they're trying to beat back all efforts to bring in low carbon fuel standards, the Fuel Quality Directive in Europe, and basically, small efforts to reduce carbon emissions in the U.S. and Europe. So I was struck by just how intense. It's the main thing that Canadian diplomatic staff does in the U.S. Is lobbying for the energy file, which is mostly about lobbying for oil from Alberta. So that was a particularly striking element of conservative foreign policy that I was maybe more ignorant of than I should have been in going into researching for this book.
Okay. Now, how do you think that Canada's image as the ugly image has occurred in the world?
Well, I think it's from policy that goes against the interests of the majority of people. The Harper government's support for Canadian mining company in Guatemala, for instance, that's displacing indigenous communities and leading to all kinds of toxic sludge that has serious impacts on local communities' well-being. When those communities realize that the Canadian government is right there with the Canadian mining company, defending it, advancing its interests at every step of the way, I think that certainly tarnishes Canada's image. I think on the question of Palestine and the Conservatives' over-the-top support for Israel in all situations, in all circumstances, despite Israel's ongoing dispossession of Palestinians. I think that's something that certainly tarnishes Canada's reputation with most of the world that sees Palestinian rights as legitimate and important. So I think that basically it's policy. It's the Harper government's extreme pro-corporate, pro-empire policy that is tarnishing Canada's image around the world.
Now, on the topic of Israel, Stephen Harper's government is very pro-Israel. Your book looks into the ties with the Israeli right. What do you think Canadians need to know about those ties and how it affects Canadian policy and their voting?
Yeah, I think that there's lots of elements of, I wrote a whole book about the history of Canada's relations with Israel and support for Israel's dispossession of Palestinians. So there's lots of different elements, but I think one element that people would be very disturbed by is the role of the growing ties between the Canadian military and the Israeli military, and not just at the military, the Canadian Forces level, but also at the corporate level, and growing ties between Canadian weapons producers and Israeli weapons producers. I think one element that most people are probably not aware of is the role of Canadian groups with charitable status in this country are allowed to support settlers in the occupied West Bank, and that's one of the changes that the Harper government has really sort of solidified, is allowing groups that are subsidized by the Canadian state to support Israeli settlers that are contravening international law. So I think that's an element of the policy that many Canadians would be very disturbed by, and that's effectively a state subsidy for the most extreme anti-Palestinian Israelis. So it's, I think, a particularly disturbing element of the Conservatives' pro-Israel support.
Okay. In the current confrontation with Iran, what do you fear are the effects on the positions that Harper's taken?
Well, I think one thing that we should first refer to what's going on with Iran as a low-level war. I think Canada's at low-level war against Iran, and there's a whole bunch of facets to that, from attempt to really crush Iran's economy to Canadian naval vessels patrolling off the coast of Iran, running provocative maneuvers, to obviously Canadian troops occupying a country bordering Iran, to the most recent element of that campaign, the cutting off of diplomatic relations, which has traditionally been seen as sort of the first step to a full-scale declaration of war. And it's a campaign that unfortunately has the potential of escalating to something more serious, a full-scale Israeli or Israeli-U.S. bombing campaign of Iran. And Iran is not a completely powerless country, so that would probably lead to a reaction from Iran that could then lead to a further escalation, and you could have a very serious situation for not just Iranians, but for many people, certainly throughout the Middle East and maybe even the world, where you have a situation of escalation. And the Harper government is really at the forefront of prodding, supporting the most extreme elements within Israel that are, Benjamin Netanyahu and who pushing for war. And that's, I think, something that goes against, polls show it goes against what most Canadians want. Very few Canadians want any sort of military kind of component to the reaction to Iran. So it's a very disturbing element of Harper's foreign policy that is very live as we speak today.
Do you think it's taking away from the whole? Canada used to be seen through the lens of peacekeepers and nonviolent in a lot of ways. And do you think that we're becoming a bit of a warrior-focused or war-focused in our policies and decisions? Yeah,
that's definitely a central component in understanding Harper's foreign policy. He takes a very strongly pro-military policy, and he does so for a whole series of reasons. From the fact that lots of support among the military companies, too. I think there's a cultural element to that. And the Harper government is basically preparing for ongoing war, future wars, and sort of repeated wars, increasing the military budget, establishing 7 Canadian military bases in countries around the world, so permanent Canadian military bases elsewhere, preparing for future actions, future wars. At the cultural level, in terms of spending huge amounts of money, in terms of convincing Canadians to be more militaristic. So it is certainly a departure from a recent history of Canadian foreign policy, or it's an expansion of some of the changes I think we saw under the Paul Martin government. Some of the history of peacekeeping is very distorted, and many Canadians have a misconception about the real history of Canadian foreign policy on that front. But there certainly was a time in Canadian foreign policy, a couple of decades of Canadian foreign policy, when it was much less militaristic than it is today. And the Harper government's really been at the forefront of pushing it in what I would consider the wrong direction in terms of a more militarized foreign policy.
And the subject of your book was obviously on foreign policy in Canada and Harper's foreign policy. Now, that's a large topic for a lot of Canadians to grasp. What do you think the major message of your book, or the major information you'd like Canadians to take into the polling booth next election year?
Well, I think the major point of the book is to try to raise awareness and try to get Canadians thinking about what Canadian foreign policy is about, and starting to pay attention to these issues. And part of the way that the Harper government gets away with what it gets away with is that most Canadians are not actively engaged on these issues, and more so than there's all kinds of problems with domestic issues where the elite get to dominate the discussion. But on foreign policy, it's that much greater because we have that much less of a personal experience with the matter. So the goal of the book and the sticker campaign, the Stop Harper's Crime sticker campaign that sort of goes along with this tour, is to try to raise awareness, try to get Canadians thinking about the issues. And in terms of at the voting booth, of course, I hope people will vote against the Harper Conservatives. But I think that's a very small component of a much bigger process, trying to raise awareness, trying to build a coalition of groups that will challenge Canadian foreign policy, or rekindle some of those groups that have been active, some of the anti-war groups, some of the mining groups, the Latin American solidarity groups, the Palestinian solidarity groups, sort of really get them directed towards challenging Canadian foreign policy. And I think the voting component is a component, but it's a small component after a much bigger sort of social movement building process.
Okay, you talked a little bit about the sticker campaign. Do you want to elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, well, we produced 300,000 Stop Harper's Crime stickers, and Alroy, who's here, set up the website, and it's basically, there's 4 points in the stickers: one on climate, mining, Palestinian rights, and militarism, and it's about trying to raise awareness about Harper's foreign policy and how destructive it is. It's a small first step in hope for a bigger campaign, but it's hopefully if people can come out to events over the coming months, there will be stickers for people to get and to put up in all kinds of public places and help in fighting back against Harper's foreign policy.
Okay, so your book tour is here in Ottawa, and so tonight only. And then what locations are on the stop next?
It's about 30 cities. Next stop is Montreal on October 9th, Quebec City October 16th, and then a full month of night after night, beginning in Hamilton throughout Southern Ontario to the west and then over into the Maritimes.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for your time. Nice to meet you.